First, Dani, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the album, I'd like to jump into something else. I read somewhere that you are a big fan of movie scores.
Movie scores, yeah, absolutely love them. Yeah.
What is one that sticks out from your youth? Do you remember?
Well, it's still one of my favourites. Aside from the Star Wars movies, obviously John Williams,
right,
and the Omen trilogy, which are, I remember from my youth. But the one that that really got me into soundtracks was Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula.
Okay.
Because it's, aside from Star Wars and The Omen, it's the first film when I watched it, the music really overly enhanced everything about the film. And I can't pronounce his name right, Dracula. Polish guy, Polish composer who's also done The Ninth Gate, etc., etc., and Death and the Maiden. But I still love it today. It's still probably when I listen to it again, I absolutely get taken away by it. It's just monstrously dark, and then it's really seductively sort of romantic. It's just got everything about it. It's just so evocative. I love it. The only thing that ruins it is, as with a lot of those film scores from that particular point in history, like Interview with a Vampire, for example, which was another big, gothic movie.
Sure.
Was they always put a credits song that's got nothing to do with it. So we had Annie Lennox. She did this song about a love song for a vampire. But what annoys me more than anything is that I've watched the movie so many times, I can pinpoint there's a bit of music that's really great, which I would have called The Chase or something like that, when they're following Dracula's gypsies to the castle. And this great bit of music goes on, and it's not on the soundtrack.
Okay.
But they gave Annie Lennox a space, do you know what I mean? And you just think, why? Well, we know why, but it just ruined the soundtrack for me. If they just had that instead of her, ace. The best thing. Well, it is the best thing ever, but anyway.
But so, at what age was this when you first kind of saw these movies and heard these soundtracks?
Because
Star Wars.
I actually didn't see Coppola's Dracula till about a year after it came out.
Okay.
I was trying to be fashionably late. I think I just couldn't afford to go to the cinema back then. So I got the soundtrack. I think it was the Christmas of '93.
Okay.
And since then, I mean, when I'm working, I always put soundtracks on all the time because I don't want someone shouting in my ear when I'm trying to write. I'd like my own soundtrack, to take around with me. Go to the supermarket, big soundtrack as I open the doors. It'd be great. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So when did you started noticing kind of that the music could tell a story and could kind of evoke a mood and that kind of...
Well, pretty much from that point onwards, because after that, it was Kenneth Branagh's Frankenstein, it was Interview with a Vampire, then it was some of the silver screen reissues of the Hammer horror films, like Taste of Blood of Dracula and etc., etc. Danny Elfman's film score for Sleepy Hollow.
Sure.
Well, actually, that was years later, to be honest. But yeah, I mean.
But so this was because obviously you were already playing in bands, but this was then around the time where Cradle of Filth started.
Well, yeah. Well, Cradle of Filth were well on their way to their debut album by that point.
Okay.
But it definitely was a big factor in adding atmosphere and keyboards and tonal layers to our music. And since then, we've even from the debut album, we've integrated like little orchestral pieces into our albums. But strangely enough, not this new one. That's one thing that does differ with the new album, that we don't have an actual intro orchestral piece or orchestral interludes, but they are part and parcel of the bodies of other songs.
Was that done consciously?
Actually, that was one of the few things on this album that was consciously done. People go, this album's got a lot more new wave of British heavy metal, which boils down to one or two things. Either it's more like Judas Priest or it's more like Iron Maiden. by which they mean it's got a lot more twin guitar work that's melodic. And yes, it has, but we've always had that. It's just that these songs are different and they've got more in it.
Right.
But it was a conscious decision not to have a bombastic... we do have a bombastic intro, but it just happens to have drums and, you know, big choir parts and... You know, it's more like a traditional metal song than a soundtrack.
And when you start working on an album, because obviously you released the previous album, then you toured, and then it settles down a little bit, and you have to start thinking about what's next. So where do you start? Do you start with kind of what will be the intro, or how do we want to start this album?
Well, with this record, something else that differed was that we decided to do a sort of team building exercise. We were doing a festival in Slovakia, so we took ourselves as a band, a collective that's spread all around the world, to the hometown of Marthas, the drummer, and Ashok, the guitarist, which is Brno in the Czech Republic. And we sort of, aside from team building and drinking a lot and sightseeing, the main purpose of that was to collate everybody's ideas. And by the end of the week, we literally had everything we needed for an album.
Okay.
At that point, I didn't really have a theme as such, because I didn't know, there's no point coming up with a theme unless you've got one beforehand, but not based on just say one or two songs, because you don't know if those songs are going to be the right direction or not, and they might not even be used. But when you've got like 6 or 7 tracks, or the crux of an album, you kind of know where it's going. And at that point, I'd been reading a lot of Victorian supernatural horror, E.F. Benson, Robert Louis Stevenson, Arthur Conan Doyle, Arthur Machen, that sort of thing. And it suddenly dawned on me that the Victorian era was an age of like morbidity,
Sure.
and that it would be a good sort of stage to set the album on. And so therefore the whole album took this Victorian vibe, so henceforth the title Cryptoriana.
But the interesting thing then is because, well, you say you were on retreat in Czech Republic, and this Victorian element is very much very British. So does your surroundings, does that have an influence on kind of where something can go?
Well, it does. Yeah, it does. But the Eastern European vibe fits very nicely in with Dracula as well.
Right.
And I think, much like somebody's been mentioning, the seductiveness of decay reminds them of Brexit. That's what some journalists, 3 journalists have said that thus far. 3 journalists.
I won't, I promise.
And then I related that to the fact that Brexit, you know, a lot of people voted for Brexit because they see people coming from different parts of the world, and they think that, you know, this is simple-minded people who think that the reason the NHS in Britain's in trouble, or whether they haven't got jobs and they see, you know, Polish people with lots of jobs, basically it's because Polish people will work jobs that the British people won't bother doing.
Sure.
So anyway, there's that fear, that inbred fear, which is, you know, it's an awful thing. But relating back to Dracula, that's another reason why it was such a success, because Dracula represents that fear. That fear, you know, that was prevalent in the Victorian era as well, and he just represented everything that was foreign and unnatural, and threatening to undermine, you know, this British Empire. So yeah, I suppose you could relate it to a part of Brexit somehow.
And if you want, you can always find a way.
Yeah. Well, you know, that doesn't represent my views at all,
Sure.
by the way.